Dad came to my apartment with toys for 2 young kids. I do not have any kids. My dad did something so weird yesterday that I can't stop thinking about it. My brain is just spinning in circles trying to figure it out. My family has so much drama that I could write 10 books about it, but I'll try to be simple. I'm 25 years old and don't have any kids. I've never even been married. I have one brother, who's 27, and a sister who's 22. My brother is in a serious relationship with a nice woman, but they aren't thinking about having kids right now. My sister still lives with our mom, and she doesn't have a boyfriend or kids. My parents are divorced and my mom is remarried. My dad stayed single. He lives with my uncle and his wife. My stepfather is fine, they got married after I moved out. My sister says they're normal. Here's what happened. I live in a cheap apartment about 45 minutes away from my dad. It's on the 3rd floor, and you have to walk through the building to get to my door. Yesterday, around 6 p.m., my dad knocked on my door. I didn't expect him, so I was surprised to see him. He gave me a quick hug. He was holding a few toy boxes. They looked like Fisher-Price toys for little kids, maybe even babies. I was confused, but didn't say anything about the toys because I didn't think they were for me. He looked totally normal. He wasn't acting weird, wasn't sweaty, his eyes didn't seem off. We didn't get too close to each other when we hugged, so I didn't smell anything strange like alcohol or smoke. I asked him why he was there, and he said he was shopping nearby when he saw the toys and wanted to give them to the girls. I said, "Who?" He gave me 2 names I didn't recognize. I tried to think of anyone in our family those names could belong to, but I couldn't figure it out. He looked over my shoulder into my apartment and asked if the kids were here or if they were with Mike. He asked if Mike was my husband. I had never heard the name Mike before. I was so confused, and I could tell my dad was starting to get confused too. I told him that I wasn't married and I didn't have any kids. He insisted that I did. I repeated myself, but he just shook his head. Now, I was getting worried. Was my dad lost? Had he lost his mind? Was he having a mental breakdown? I asked him if he knew where he was. He got really angry, really fast. He told me yes, of course, he knew where he was and who I was. I asked him some questions I've seen in movies, like, do you know what time it is? Or the year. He just got angrier. He started yelling in my face. You think this is funny, and, are you trying to make me look stupid? There were little bubbles of spit forming in the corners of his mouth. He went from calm to crazy so quickly that I got scared and stepped back. He took my stepping back as an insult. He screamed, "Oh, now you're scared? You're scared of me? Guess I'll just FK off then." He stormed out of my apartment, kicking his feet like a little kid, down the hallway. I wanted to chase after him, but he was so mad I was worried he'd hurt me. The whole thing lasted less than 5 minutes. I closed and locked my door. I called my mom, uncle, and siblings right away. None of them had any idea what happened. I asked my mom and sister if I was the crazy one and had kids I'd forgotten about, but they assured me that wasn't true. My uncle told me that Dad left the house around 4 p.m. to go shopping in my area, so that part was true. I told my uncle what had happened. He said he'd try to find out what was going on and call me with updates. It's the next morning, and I still haven't heard anything. I spent all night trying to understand what happened. These are my ideas. Maybe he has another kid we don't know about. He has a daughter with another woman, who's married and has 2 children. If that's true, why did he go to my apartment? Did he mix me up with his other daughter? He said he knew where he was, so I'm not sure. Did he drive here on autopilot? He would have had to get out of his car and walk up to my apartment. Maybe he snapped out of it then? Maybe he was angry because he realized what he'd done and panicked. But it would have been easy to just lie about what happened. He could have had a mental breakdown. That was my first thought, but he seemed so normal. He drove out here, went to the store, and bought things without any trouble. That means he must have been in control of his mind. Maybe he was somewhere else in his mind? I thought maybe he was in the past, and thought I was someone else. But he said he knew where he was and who I was. I didn't recognize any of the names he said as anyone in my family. He might have done this on purpose. I don't know why he would do that. He loves drama, our whole family does. But this seems way too extreme, and makes him look bad, which isn't like him. If he was going to cause drama, he would want to make himself look good. He'd want to be the victim. Maybe he wanted sympathy? Maybe he's going to pretend that this was some kind of stress breakdown? He didn't seem super stressed out at work, as far as I knew. He's been working the same job for years and he seemed happy enough. He just complained about working overtime sometimes. He could be developing dementia. I know early onset dementia is possible, but he's just barely 50. Yes, he's getting older, but not that old. He's never shown any signs of memory problems until now. This is a huge change out of nowhere. I don't know what's going on. I'm starting to get really worried about my dad. I called my uncle again this morning, but he didn't pick up. My siblings haven't been able to reach him either. I think his phone's dead. I left him a voicemail and a text message, but who knows if he's seen them. My uncle is the only one who can really help my dad, but he's not answering me. Here's what I know. I'm 25 years old, I've never been married, and I don't have any kids. My dad showed up at my apartment with toys for 2 little kids, and then got really angry when I asked him what he was talking about. I need help. I finally got a call from my uncle, who explained that my dad had gone to the hospital the night before, and that was why he had not returned my calls. He said it wasn't an attempt on my father's life, but I couldn't believe him. My uncle seemed to think he was doing me a favor by keeping me in the dark. I got more and more frustrated the longer he spoke, his words feeling more and more like excuses, more like lies. What had really happened? What secret was he hiding? My dad, I soon found out, had a massive concussion. His brain injury was so severe that it was causing him to confabulate, which was what had been happening during his visit to my apartment. He was confused and had mixed up parts of his life. His brain blended real-life events with things that happened to others. This isn't unheard of, but the part one couldn't understand was how my dad had gotten that bad. I couldn't reconcile the seemingly uninjured man who'd shown up at my apartment with the man now in the hospital, brain injured and possibly dying. The girls he was trying to give the toys to, I was told, were the daughters of a coworker. My dad had somehow confused them with his own daughters. It seemed impossible, since there was no truth to any of his statements about Mike, a husband, or having children. His behavior felt impossible, but the doctor explained that confabulation could cause people to completely rewrite reality, filling in the blanks with details from other parts of their lives. It seemed impossible, but he explained that confabulation could cause people to completely rewrite reality, filling in the blanks with details from other parts of their lives. After I got the call, I drove over to the hospital to see my dad. It was hard to look at him lying in that bed. He's usually such a strong, healthy man, but he looked like a ghost. The way his eyes looked, sunken and lifeless, almost made me think he was already gone. I talked to him for a little while, but he was really out of it. He forgot my name a few times, and kept getting confused about where he was and why he was there. After visiting my dad, I sat with my uncle, who couldn't give me a good explanation of what had happened. I wanted to just yell at him, but all I could do was whisper, "Tell me what happened, really tell me." I could sense that he was hiding something, and that's what was making me so upset. He kept making excuses. He fell, he insisted. He said my dad tripped getting out of his car, hit his head, and got a concussion. My uncle kept saying that it was just an accident, a fall. But I couldn't shake the feeling that he was hiding the truth. Something just didn't feel right. I knew how my dad could be, and I knew how my uncle could be, and it didn't seem right. I knew that I couldn't get anything else out of my uncle, so I finally just went back to see my dad. I had a lot of questions for my dad, but he didn't seem able to answer them. I felt like I was just watching the shell of a man, not the dad I knew. My head was buzzing. I just didn't understand what happened, and what my uncle was keeping from me. The next day, I went back to the hospital to see my dad, and I asked to see his doctor again. I tried to hide the anger in my voice, but I felt like it was coming out anyway. I asked him the questions I'd been thinking about all night, the questions I wanted to ask my uncle, but was afraid of getting another set of lies. I asked if my dad's injuries were consistent with a fall, if the way his head was hit was the type of injury you'd get from tripping and hitting your head. The doctor looked at me for a long time, as if he were looking deep inside me, as if he were searching for something. He said, the injury was caused by a significant impact to the head. He couldn't give me the exact answer I was hoping for, the answer that would let me know my uncle was lying. The doctor looked at me with concern and said that they hadn't been able to get a complete picture of what happened, that the case was complex and he couldn't tell me more. I felt a rush of anger as I stared at the doctor. I wanted the truth, not just more uncertainty. Is there anything else you can tell me? Is there something else you're not saying? He said he couldn't say anything else, because it wouldn't be ethical for him to discuss other patients without their consent. I asked if he could just confirm or deny my uncle's story, to tell me if he thought it was believable. You can't give me that? Can't even confirm or deny it? He told me he just couldn't. I left his office feeling even more frustrated. My mind was racing, all those hours, those days, wondering what had happened to my dad, wondering what my uncle had done. I still had so many questions. I was worried about my dad, I was worried about my uncle, I was even starting to worry about myself. This had become bigger than me. It had become something I didn't understand, something that was taking over my life. I felt helpless. My uncle still didn't tell me what happened, but he was there for the hospital visit every day, and it seemed like he wanted to get closer to my dad. It was weird, but it was his way of showing his love. Or maybe, that's what I wanted to believe. My dad was making progress, but it was slow and I didn't think he was going to get back to who he was before the injury. The doctor kept telling me not to get my hopes up, but my dad had always been a fighter, he'd gotten through so much, how could I not believe he'd be alright? I stayed at the hospital for the next couple of days, trying to make sure my dad had what he needed. It was difficult, seeing how sick he was. After a few days, I was finally ready to go home for a little bit. I knew I would need to get back to the hospital later in the day, but I wanted to get a break from the feeling of worry that was starting to fill me up, like I was carrying around a giant rock in my stomach. I went back to my apartment and just sat down on my couch. It was so quiet, not like the busy hospital with the constant beeping and alarms, or the noise of the city, that I felt disoriented. I had been sitting there, just thinking about my dad, and the situation I was in, for a while when I suddenly remembered my dad's phone. When he'd gotten angry at me in my apartment and ran away, his phone had been ringing. I'd taken his phone from the floor, where it had fallen from his pocket, when he'd left my apartment, but I'd been too upset to really think about it. I went into my bedroom, grabbed his phone, and looked at it. The caller ID showed the name, Mike, the name my dad had been repeating over and over to me in my apartment. It was weird, because I'd never heard that name before. I wondered if I could call back, if he could maybe help me understand what happened. I flipped the phone over and looked at the home screen. My dad had pictures of a bunch of young women. The photos were of them hanging out, smiling and hugging. They weren't women he would have dated. I didn't even think my dad was interested in dating anymore. They looked like young people just getting out of high school, even. I looked at the pictures again, but nothing clicked. I decided to call back the number that had called. The voice on the other side of the phone was loud, almost boisterous, and very sure of themselves. I decided to see what happened if I just stayed quiet and let the caller explain themselves. The voice on the other side said, "Is this Tom? Hello?" My hand tightened on the phone as I heard the man's voice. I felt my heart start to beat faster. I tried to calm myself, to get myself back under control. "Mike?" I asked. The man said, "I need to talk to Tom, he owes me money." He sounded like he was angry and getting impatient. The anger was starting to build in my chest, starting to push me. "He's not here right now. What did you want?" I asked. I didn't even know what I was asking, my mind racing, unable to grasp the situation I had suddenly found myself in. I felt completely lost. The man said, "Just tell him to call me back. He knows what he did. Tell him we're gonna talk." He hung up the phone, leaving me there with the echoing sound of my own heartbeat in my ears. What had my dad done? What had he gotten into? It was like something out of a movie, an old mystery movie, where everything was tied together with strings you couldn't see until they pulled back to show you everything in the end. I thought that was just for the movies. It didn't feel like that, not at all. It felt real, and dangerous, and too much to take in all at once. I felt so small. I knew I had to get back to the hospital and see my dad. But everything that was going on, it just felt like the world was getting bigger and bigger. The phone in my hand was cold. My whole body was numb. I knew that this phone call changed everything, but I didn't know how to make sense of what it all meant. What had my dad gotten into, and how had this situation become my responsibility? A couple of days went by. My dad was slowly recovering. Each day that he was awake and alert was a small miracle, even though the doctor kept saying that the prognosis was grim. The doctor was worried about my dad's recovery, and said that there was no telling what he could still be like after all this. He explained that the trauma could leave him with a wide range of problems, like dementia, even if he recovered. I didn't want to think about it, didn't want to believe him. My dad was going to get better, I knew it. I had to believe it. I still had questions for my uncle, questions that were growing louder every day. I went to see my dad at the hospital, and I made sure to schedule a time when my uncle was coming to see him. I had to get some answers. I had to find out what was going on. I made sure that my dad wasn't watching when I asked my uncle about the concussion. My uncle looked at me, startled. "You shouldn't talk to your dad about it," he said. "He'll just get confused again." He seemed to be getting anxious, almost nervous, and he was trying to hide it. "Why was he confused, though?" I said. "Why was he trying to give those toys to people he didn't even know?" "Oh, well," he stammered. "I told you he's got some brain problems, doesn't know who he is, even." He didn't want to answer my questions. He just sat there. "How did he get hurt?" I insisted, trying to stay calm. "He's just not well," he was probably confused. "You know how he is, kind of clumsy," my uncle said. His tone was getting evasive, almost angry. "But my dad isn't clumsy," I said, finally losing my temper. I felt like I was losing control, felt a wave of anger rising up, like a tidal wave about to break on the beach. "That's not how he is. He's been so healthy, always got up early to go to work. He doesn't forget things. What happened to him? He didn't just get hurt out of nowhere. You're not telling me something." I watched him as he tried to respond, watched him try to find words, to make an excuse. He wouldn't meet my eyes, looked away, like he was guilty. He said, "You just don't know." He finally let himself look at me, then lowered his gaze again. "What do you know? What are you hiding?" I asked, pressing him, my anger getting louder, taking over everything I felt and everything I thought. I watched him squirm as I asked the question. He closed his eyes. "I can't tell you," he said quietly. He opened his eyes, looked around the room, avoiding my gaze. He said, "It was an accident. I told you, a fall. It's not like he got hit on purpose, he was just a little confused." I looked at him. I couldn't believe what I was hearing, the way he was trying to shut me out. "An accident? So, you're saying he fell getting out of his car, and hit his head on the ground, hard enough to get a massive concussion and cause brain damage?" I asked, as though I could see the words in his mind. "Yes," he mumbled. He wasn't meeting my gaze, his face was pale, and his hands were shaking. He glanced at the door to my dad's hospital room, nervously, as if he thought he could run away. "He doesn't seem very confused to me," I whispered. I kept looking at my uncle, staring through him as if I were trying to find the answers in his eyes. My uncle looked around again. He looked down at his hands. "Yeah, well," he said quietly, almost nervously. He was clearly lying. Something just felt wrong about the way he was looking at me, the way his voice shook as he said it, and how much he was trying to avoid answering. He was lying about something, I just knew it. He seemed to sense that I knew. He quickly changed the subject. So, your dad is going to be alright, I know he will. He looked back up at me. His eyes seemed to plead with me. I didn't say anything. He stood up. It's getting late, I should go, he said. I nodded and turned back toward my father, the anger still buzzing in my ears. My uncle looked away, looked back at me, and then turned away as if to leave. He stopped at the doorway, turning his head toward me for a moment. Don't tell him that I told you that I can't say anything, he whispered. Why would I said coldly. He wasn't going to talk about it, and he wouldn't let anyone else talk about it either. My uncle nodded again, and then slipped out of the room, leaving me to face the giant wave of anger, and confusion, and anxiety, building inside of me. I didn't know what to do. I still didn't know how my dad had gotten the concussion. I needed to know what really happened, I needed the truth. After I left the hospital, I sat in my car and thought about everything that had happened over the past couple of weeks. I couldn't understand how things had gotten this complicated, and I couldn't understand why my uncle wasn't telling me the truth. I thought about the name, Mike, and the phone call I'd gotten. How could that have anything to do with my dad's concussion? It was like the world was getting turned inside out, like everything I knew was being turned upside down. There were too many pieces, too many puzzle parts that just didn't fit. I needed to find the answers, I needed the truth, I needed to figure out what was really happening. I needed to help my dad. As I drove home, I noticed that my phone was buzzing. I was so distracted that I didn't really look at who was calling, just swiped my finger on the screen to answer. The sound of a woman's voice startled me, as though I was jumping back into a dream, from my own life, into a dream where things felt familiar, but different, not like they were in my own life. Hi, she said, I'm so sorry to bother you, but I'm trying to reach your dad. Her voice was nice, she sounded like she cared. I felt a glimmer of hope, maybe she had answers. Maybe she was trying to tell me something, to give me clues to help me figure out what was going on. Hello? I said, I'm so sorry to call you, but is this the right number? Is this Tom's daughter? She asked. It seemed strange, and I had to think for a minute before realizing that this was the girl from the picture, the one with the pretty, brown hair and bright smile, the girl who'd been next to my dad, on the photo in his phone. The photo made it seem like they were close, maybe best friends? Or maybe something more, but that wasn't my dad. He didn't seem the type, and I couldn't imagine him ever doing something like that. Yes, I said. I waited for her to explain, waited to hear what she wanted. I called because I needed to talk to him, she said. We need to talk about something really important. She said it as though she was in a hurry, as though she needed to get to a point, but didn't know how to start. It's very important. I decided to see if I could get more out of her. Did he do something? I asked, trying to get more information. What did he need to talk to you about? I hoped that by asking, maybe I could hear something about a fall, or something more, something that could tell me what my uncle was hiding. Maybe this was it, maybe this was the truth. She sighed. Yes, she said, I tried calling Tom the other night, but it went straight to voicemail, so I was going to come over, but he'd already been taken to the hospital. She sounded almost relieved, almost as if she was glad he was already at the hospital, as though I could hear a subtle sadness, as if she'd just lost hope. It made me feel more worried, not less. She must have been worried, why would she be calling me otherwise? What did you need to talk to him about? I asked. Just some things, she said, her voice turning quieter. Stuff that's been going on. Her voice became strained, as if she was trying to hide her sadness. Like what? I pressed her. My frustration was getting more intense. Like a fire getting bigger and hotter. Do you know what happened to him? Why is he in the hospital? I desperately wanted her to answer, wanted her to know the answers to my questions, to give me some clues, so I could figure out the puzzle and save my dad. She paused. Her breathing became faster, like she was having trouble speaking. You wouldn't understand. How can I understand if you're not telling me anything? I asked, my voice growing louder. I'm sorry, but I have to go now, she said, as though she'd reached her limit, her voice suddenly turning firm, not wanting to talk about it anymore, as though she was trying to leave the problem behind. She hung up the phone. The sound of my own voice still echoed in my ears. I could hear the worry in the tone of my voice, the desperate hope that she would give me some answers. The woman's voice, the tone in her words, had made me so angry. I couldn't figure out why she wouldn't give me answers. She seemed to know what had happened to my dad, and she seemed to be keeping it from me. I wasn't sure what to do, but I knew that I had to find out the truth.